Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Privilege and Pride, a panel discussion and community conversation on the topic of white privilege with Lakeshore's United Visionaries. We're going to be joined by one other person who is having a little bit of computer problems, but he will be here shortly. Before we get going, I just wanted to remind everyone that this is a community conversation focused on sharing experiences. I know it's at the same time as our Great Decisions lecture series, but this isn't intended to be an intellectual presentation. You know, it's not a scholarly dissertation with a guest speaker on white privilege. This is a program about developing a greater understanding about what the issue is and moving together stronger as a community. And so really, the bottom line is it's about sharing experiences. So if at any point during the conversation that's going on tonight, you have any questions or comments that you would like to make, which we'll get to at the end of the program, just type them into the comments box on either the Facebook platform or your YouTube channel, and I will bring those questions into the conversation. But I do need to remind you that hate speech, derogatory comments, and racial slurs will not be tolerated in the least bit. So be cognizant of that fact. That's against library policy. It's against common decency. So please be aware of that. So I'm going to take myself out of the picture at this point and let everyone introduce themselves. Let's get started with Amanda. Why don't you kick things off and introduce yourself?
My name is Amanda Worley. I am the secretary on the board of directors for Lakeshore's United Visionaries.
Hello, my name is Patrick Neunfeld. I've worked professionally in higher education for over 15 years. I serve on the board of a number of community organizations, including Love's Board, and I'm also the current president of PFLAG Manitowoc County.
And actually, the person who is having problems with their webcam at this point, Kevin Seifert, was supposed to introduce himself at this point. When he comes back on, I'll let him introduce himself. But Sonia, why don't you jump the line, as it were?
All right, so I am Sonia Vasquez. I am Lakeshore's United Visionaries president. I'm also the head of the Arts and Humanities Committee for our organization. And I, try to do other things within the community with other organizations as well.
Kevin, go.
Hi, guys.
Cheers. So, Kevin, why don't you introduce yourself to the people watching?
Hello, everyone. My name is Kevin Seifert. I am the public relations chairperson for Lakeshore's United Visionaries. I joined the group back in June, kind of before we were like officially a group, I guess. And I've been trucking along with them ever since. I'm also currently a board member for the Maskers community theater group here in Manitowoc. And I do a lot of theater and music and all that kind of stuff in the community. And I'm very excited to be here today to kind of talk about some of these tough issues. So thanks for having me.
Okay, and I am Natasha Khan, and I am the Vice President of Lakeshore's United Visionaries. I am the chair of the Governance Committee, and then I'm also a member of the Finance Committee.
Great. Well, welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening and being open to sharing your experiences. We're going to move on to talk a little bit about the organization, to talk about Love itself. So, Sonia, why don't you go ahead and do that?
Sure. So, Lakeshore's United Visionaries, and we are Lakeshore's United Visionaries, and this is the panel. If you could go on to the next slide, Tim, that would be great. So we get a lot of questions about our logo. So we're kind of starting off with that and just giving a little bit of background on that. It was designed by myself in collaboration with input from other members. You know, we move as a group on everything that we do. So that was a thing that we voted on and collaborated on together to get the right logo for us. And we chose the fist because it's a historical and contemporary symbol of solidarity and strength and unity. The colors are representative of different groups. So the white, red, yellow, black were chosen to represent the medicine wheel of Indigenous people. The colors of deep brown and lighter brown represent other communities of color. So then the outline of the logo is similar in shape to Wisconsin. So we added the shape of Manitowoc County with respect to our local community. So that's the little gray part there underneath the thumb. And the heart within the county shape represents the city of Manitowoc, where we were founded, most frequently do our work, and aim to bring unity through education, understanding, and love. And for our mission and purpose, our mission is Lakeshore's United Visionaries seeks to bring unity in the community through education, understanding, and love. And our purpose statement is Lakeshore's United Visionaries is an organization dedicated to celebrating and uplifting the lives of Black, Indigenous, and people of color in the Lakeshore area. While shining light on our beautiful diversity, we vow to bring the entire Lakeshore together through education, understanding, and love. And some of our goals. So our goals are pretty widespread, but we do focus on certain things. So under community, we have create community through events, activities, trainings, and education that coincide with our mission to bring unity through education, understanding, and love. Educate. Education is a huge thing for us. We're all about education. So educate local government agencies and businesses on inclusivity and diversity. And awareness, bringing awareness to homelessness, poverty, mental health, substance abuse, and intersectionality of identity in our community. And then advocacy. So we advocate for voter suppression, advocate against voter suppression and increase voter accessibility amongst BIPOC and LGBTQ plus communities. And collaborate to create allyships with other organizations with common goals and interests. And our organizational development. So eventually we would love to have a space where we invite our community to join us in a safe space to engage in discussion and dialogue, as well as plan community events and activities focused on building unity. And then we were also seeking our 501c3 status. We are in the process of getting that status, so hopefully we will be granted that soon.
So, Kevin, could you actually speak to the topic of the evening? I'm sorry, it appears that the very bottom of this slide got cut off. So if you were going to read it, it would be great if you could fill in what we're missing. I think it's just
of course
at the bottom.
Yes, of course. So obviously the reason why we're here tonight is we're talking about privilege and power. Specifically, well, maybe not specifically, but it's the easy access point in these wider conversations is white privilege, which is a trigger word. It's a buzzer word, and people have a lot of feelings about it. So it's really important before we go forward that we kind of define what white privilege is in our context. So I'm going to read the Merriam-Webster definition of white privilege, and it says this: white privilege is a set of social and economic advantages that white people have by virtue of their race in a culture characterized by racial inequality. So going on to this next quote by Mayak Anwar, important that we say this and that we speak this, because and this direct quote is this: discussing the reality of white privilege, we're not negating or invalidating other hardships that may come with each individual circumstances. Rather, we intend to shed a light on the reality that white people are granted rights, whether they're subtle or obvious, immunities and opportunities by their skin color, regardless of whether they ask for that privilege or not. So that quote is really important in the definition of white privilege, because we're not talking about circumstantial things. There's a lot of circumstantial things that span across a multitude of different experiences, like economic class, your ability to work for certain comforts in life. That is something that we all have access to, but we're talking about biases that are ingrained into our culture, or into our political climates that give advantages towards people who are white or Anglo-Saxon, or however you want to define that, the standard, the majority standard. And sometimes you can't control the way that those things are, whether you ask for that privilege or not. And that quote is specifically what I'm referencing to there. And then there's another quote by Christine Emba. What is white privilege? It's a level of societal advantage that comes with being seen as the norm in America, automatically conferred irrespective of wealth, gender, or other factors. It makes life smoother, but it's something you would barely notice unless it was suddenly taken away, or unless it had never applied to you in the first place. And I think there's a lot of power in that quote. So that's a quote that's on the bottom that's a little cut off.
All right, thank you. So at this point in the conversation, I think it probably would be beneficial if we all heard from you about specific, experiences that you've had about, on the topic concerning white privilege and your relationship to it. Even though Patrick is the person who is up front right now, I am actually going to ask Amanda to start the ball rolling. So welcome to the larger portion of the screen, and it's all yours.
So excited to be here. So I guess like the first time I really thought about my white privilege, because obviously I'm white. I'm not really part of a specific marginalized community. I grew up in a mostly white society. The first time I really thought about having that white privilege, though, I moved to Mexico, and when I first got down there, there was a certain way that the locals would treat me. They just, they waited on me. They were very attentive. After a couple of weeks of being there, though, I got very tan from living on the beach, and people started to mistake me as one of the locals. Obviously, until I opened my mouth and started talking. But that's when it really occurred to me what a difference it was when the locals immediately recognized that I was white, compared to them thinking that I, was Hispanic. And that's what, there's a lot to be said that the area that I was living in was heavily trafficked by tourists. So white kind of meant money. So there is something to be said about that. It's just the experience that I had that actually really made me think about how even in another country, and not just specifically in the United States, that my skin color gave me privileges and opportunities that I wouldn't have had if my skin color was different.
So I'll bring the conversation back to Patrick now. What are your experiences with the topic?
Yeah. So the first time that I had heard the term white privilege, I was in a high school psychology class, and I remember thinking, really remember kind of thinking, like, what is this? Like, is this real? I don't think this really exists. I definitely had, sort of those first initial sort of reactions to the term. And it wasn't until that we read White Privilege, The Invisible Knapsack by Peggy McIntosh that I really understood what the term really meant. And realistically, I think that we as white people experience privilege as the norm, right? We're raised with that perspective that other people have race or ethnicity or culture. And I think sometimes that we fail to see that white people, white culture is the dominant culture. I think that in having the conversation about white privilege, I sometimes hear that people are being made to feel shameful or guilty. In respects to any shame or guilt that we as white people may experience surrounding a conversation about white privilege, those feelings of shame and guilt are really things that we need to work through. And I think that those feelings of shame and guilt are really coming from a place of knowing that white privilege exists and we don't yet know what to do about it.
So, Kevin, what do you have to add to the conversation at this point? Having heard from a couple of Caucasian people, establishing, what the I'm not trying to be, humorous about it, but it's like, setting the stage for what it is, further
Right.
on the definition. What do you have to add?
Right. So I think going, with the remarks made by Amanda and Patrick, my experience of privilege or lack of privilege is pretty unique, in that I have experienced both sides of the coin in my lifetime. And I say that because I have a very unique proximity to whiteness, having grown up in this community my whole life, having been adopted and having white parents. And I've had the luxury, for lack of a better word, to feel comfortable in white spaces where a lot of BIPOC people might not have those experiences. I've been able to be in rooms with cops and people of authority and not feel intimidated. I've been able to talk to strangers and have an air of belonging that makes me easily approachable. And I'm only saying that, I'm not saying that, other BIPOC people aren't able to feel comfortable or aren't able to be approachable, but in a predominantly white community, that's saying a lot. But I've also, at the same time, have had experiences of otherness where that privilege doesn't play any kind of role. I've been followed around in grocery stores because I looked at something too long. I've been pulled over because I was leaving my job and it was late at night and they were wondering why I was there. Well, I was working. I've been, profiled even in my personal dating life. There's a whole set of experiences being a darker skinned Black man keeps me away from. So it's very interesting, and that kind of duality of proximity to whiteness and yet feeling apart from whiteness has created a very interesting dichotomy within me. When we were getting ready for this talk, we talked about the notion of code switching, which, if you have not heard that term before, that is a very interesting position to be in, because it's something that's very unique to a lot of BIPOC experiences. And it's the notion of changing the way you talk or your mannerisms or the way you speak to fit into the majority or wherever you are. So the way that I'm talking right now is the way that I talk. I've always been told growing up that I talk white or I speak very white, which doesn't mean anything because the way somebody talks is not specific to any racial or cultural background. But the way that I speak, because I work in Milwaukee a lot, and I work with a lot of BIPOC people, the way that I speak to them is sometimes different than how I speak to people in my own community, and that's only because my experiences are different and they're switching and changing. And Patrick, you said something the other day that was really interesting about the defense mechanism of it.
Yeah. So I think with respects to code switching, I have also code switched in various aspects of my life as well. So certainly as a gay man, I code switch depending on my environment. Certainly if I'm in a space that is safer, I have less guards or less defenses that are up. So for gay men in particular, the process of code switching is often referred to as kind of butching it up, right? So becoming more masculine, and not to appear effeminate, right? Which then there is that safety mechanism in portraying sort of like that more masculine type energy, if you will. I don't know if people knowing that I am. So the reality is that I don't know if people knowing that I'm gay will create an unsafe environment for me, right? That's something that I can choose to identify as or not, right? However, people of color can't make that choice, right? It's a visual identifier. So I think this has certainly shifted as I've gotten older, though too. Living one's life unapologetically is a balance between safety and authenticity, I think, as well. So.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And just a little anecdote too, that I feel like a lot of people would relate to. Like, I know nothing about cars, like at all. But when I take my car into a garage, my voice gets lower and I try to speak as little as possible or speak too much to try to make it look like I know what I'm talking about. Code switching is very similar to those experiences. If you share those with me, then you kind of know what I'm talking about.
Did anyone else want to add anything to this conversation about code switching? I mean, we'll get to everyone about sharing their own personal experiences, but I think this is a very interesting topic, to bring into it. Did anyone else want to share on this?
Yeah, I can a little bit. So I think, and I'll kind of get in more into this as I talk about, my own experiences a little bit, but I think being mixed is a huge thing, with code switching, because you have two different families, right? So like I have a family that's predominantly white, and then I have a family that's predominantly Mexican. So, although like I always, kind of tried to like essentially be myself, right? I think there's a little bit of code switching that kind of goes on when I'm talking to my white family or with them versus when I'm talking to my Mexican family. And even just like what we talk about, or like I think it's almost similar to any family. So like say your partner's family is a little bit more strict and stern, and then your family is a little bit more humorous and fun. You might have some code switching sort of there where, you learn to sort of act different in those different spaces. But I think, for people of color, it's a sort of another layer of code switching that happens along with the other dynamics of code switching that may happen for anyone.
Sonia, since you do have the floor at the moment, would you like to just continue on talking about, I don't mean to cut anyone off. If anyone else would want to add into the code switching, but Sonia, why don't you just keep rolling with your experiences since you've already gotten started?
Sure. So as I said, I'm mixed. So I think that comes at a sort of different perspective and talking about white privilege. And for me personally, I think a big thing for me is that I feel like in some spaces or to certain people, I look white, and to some people I look Mexican or look like a person of color. And so that really depends on the person. That depends on where I am. That depends on all sorts of different things. So that can be another complexity of being a mixed person sometimes, that it's kind of hard to tell the differences a little bit. But that also awards me some privileges in certain spaces and times where people perceive me as white. And I readily notice it, because the instance that my background of being Mexican comes up, there's different comments made or different attitudes towards me. And you just know, you start to notice that right away, as a mixed person that may not be like readily identifiable as a person of color. And so sometimes, like, when it comes up that I'm Mexican, like the first comment is like, oh, well, like, do you like spicy food? And it's like, well, like, that doesn't mean that I'm Mexican, but then there's sort of that other space where, sometimes I get those privileges of being white, where people like trust me more or they treat me a little bit better. And I think having both of those experiences kind of makes me realize what they can be like. For instance, like my dad is from Mexico. He was born in Mexico, and he's dark skinned. So like when I'm with him places, I can see the difference at times of how people will treat him versus how people will treat me. And it's just like astoundingly different at times. And makes me like hyper aware of my interactions with people and his interactions with people, to the point where like I watch people and make sure that like nothing's happening. And I think that's a common thing with a lot of people of color is, like what Kevin was saying, him being watched in a store for looking at an item too long. The same thing has happened to my dad. And I'm always conscious of like, if I'm with him in a store, I am making sure that people are not, being that way to him, so to speak. So yeah. And, like I said, and the code switching is sort of another aspect of that. And then also just in general family experiences. So, like what it's like to have two separate families of like one being Mexican side and one being a white side. I unfortunately didn't really get to grow up with as much of the Mexican side of my family. So I didn't get to really connect to that culture, especially being primarily raised in Manitowoc. It's a predominantly white community. So that's sort of something that, I wish that our community would have and uplift a little bit more of the cultures that are here, so that other people, maybe that are mixed or that just want to get more into their culture or want to do things that represent their culture, can do that and have that representation. And then I'll hand it over to Natasha.
Yeah, so I am mixed as well. So a lot of my experiences have been similar to Sonia. So I'm half Pakistani, and even though people would say like I'm white passing in some instances, I've had my share of experiences, like racist experiences, without delving into the complications of being mixed when it comes to like my identity, because that's a whole nother thing, especially in this predominantly white area. It's a really weird dynamic when in some instances people treat you like you are one of them, like Kevin was mentioning, and other you're like treated like you are other. And I've been lucky that I haven't had too bad of experiences, but I think if it wasn't for being like so-called white passing, things could have been worse for me. Like, you don't have to have horrible things happen for you to for things like this to affect you. It's people like close family members treating you differently your whole life because you are mixed. It's people like following you in stores, and in other instances, people just being like, "What are you?" Like, that's a whole nother thing. I don't get why people think that's appropriate to ask. And it's like people calling me turban head in school, which doesn't make sense because that's not even Pakistani, and hairy, and like my mom being terrified when 9/11 happened because she thought maybe I'd get targeted because of, we live in such a conservative and white community. And I think people who like exhibit white privilege, sometimes unknowingly, they don't necessarily see how these different like small microaggressions can affect others, or how like simple situations that they may not think about, people of color have to think twice about. And many people of color have to, think about how they can act in all these different instances. Like when I'm with my Pakistani family, I feel like I'm a different person. In some ways, I feel like I can kind of just be myself because I don't have to think twice in a lot of these things that I have to normally around here think twice about. And it's just like I'm with people who look like me, so I feel more comfortable. But then while we were having this conversation, I just remembered when I was with them, we were in like traditional outfits, and I wasn't thinking anything of it because we were all wearing traditional outfits. We were all, I think it was for some event or something. And then we had to go to the store, and I was like, wasn't thinking anything of it. And one of my cousins was like, "Oh, we should probably change." And I was like, "Oh, so yeah, that's still a thing that you have to think about here, because people will still look at you differently." And yeah, it's just great.
All right, I'm going to broaden things out. Thank you so much for sharing this, everyone. I think it takes a lot of courage to step up and actually, speak about things that are so personal, even though you're not in a room with people, that you're talking to the great unknown internet audience and still feel comfortable sharing. I think that's fantastic and admirable. And I wanted to thank you for that. Prior to this evening, about a week and a half ago, we posted a form online for people to submit questions to ask you guys while the program was going on. One quick thing before I get to that, though, someone I believe submitted a comment or a question online that either got cut off or inadvertently deleted. That was not the intention, but it may have happened from what I'm reading in the comments as I'm going along. Please resubmit what you had put in. I'm not sure if it was Facebook, perhaps it was too long and it cut it off, but please resubmit what you were saying so that we can get that into the conversation towards the end. We're going to hit the questions that were submitted beforehand that we wanted to get to. So sorry for that little reference to people following along. But let's get to the first question that was submitted. And all right, here we go. First question, and this is for the entire group to answer. How do we talk to people about white privilege with people who become defensive, or even go as far as to say that they don't see color? What's a good way to go about that?
Well, I will get the ball rolling on this one. And specifically, the trigger word when we were getting ready to do this panel was the "don't see color" comment. And I say that's a trigger because what I think is very important part of people's identity is not necessarily the color of their skin. And I'm trying not to misinterpret that, but it's the cultural set of experiences that come with the color of somebody's skin. There are very specific experiences that have made me who I am as Kevin, because I grew up as a Black kid, period. So to say that you don't see my color means that you don't see parts of me, of my personality, of my life, of things that made me who I am. So of course we don't want to like separate people by color. That's not at all the goal. But in order for us to, I think, fully understand each other and to fully love each other, we have to see those experiences. And by saying that we don't see a person's color is taking away those experiences and doesn't help us understand each other. So when people say I don't see color, I'm like, no, please see my color, love my color, and when we start to see those things, I think that's where true understanding begins. So, and I don't want people to think that if you've said it before that you were trying to be rude in any way. A lot of the times when people say that to me and I correct them, they're like, "Oh, I'm so sorry." And it's like, no, it's fine. Let's just move on from that with that in mind. So that's how I feel specifically about that part of the question. But I have had some difficult conversations talking to people about privilege. And for me, it always boils down to it's not about guilt. And similar to what Patrick said before, if you're feeling guilty feelings when somebody brings up the idea of white privilege, that's on you. And you have to kind of sort through why you're feeling guilty about those. But talking about privilege is not about guilt. It's about what gives you an advantage in the greater scheme of things.
Yeah, I think to just quickly add into there, the I don't see color comment. I think I think it's well intentioned, right? So like it generally comes from people that to maybe show that they support other people, but it's just maybe it's misaligned. And I think the thing is that part of like what our goals are is to highlight and to show diversity. So diversity meaning skin color, meaning the culture, just all sorts of different things with with if you're Black or if you're Mexican or whatever. It's looking at the whole picture of that and representing that and seeing that difference in maybe that culture or those identities and appreciating them, and not just ignoring that because you don't want to be racist. The anti-racist thing to do is to look at those cultures and learn about them and accept them and bring more unity to the community through understanding them.
I think I would definitely agree. The phrase "I don't see color," I think sometimes comes from a place of good intentions, right? But the impact is very, very different. I think sometimes we have to recognize that when we say "I don't see color," what we're really saying is that we're unwilling to acknowledge the reality of racism or the reality of harassment and discrimination that Black, Indigenous, and people of color really, really experience. I think the same is also true for people who might say, "Well, I have Black friends," and I was in a training, and this was an example that was shared, and it really resonated with me. Because the reality is that if your friends who are people of color aren't able to come to you and have meaningful conversation about the harassment, the discrimination, the racism that they experience, then the reality is that you really don't have Black friends. And I think that that's something that's really important to acknowledge, right? If you're not able to have those hard conversations, those difficult conversations, and kind of just I think marinate in the uncomfortableness of that, then you need to do some more self-reflection, and I think that that's an important component. With respects to having a conversation about privilege in general, with people who become defensive, I think that their defensiveness is often coming from a place of fear, and that fear is really rooted in a lack of understanding. And frankly, I don't know that a conversation is the best at that particular time. Maybe there's an opportunity to circle back and have a more meaningful discussion and dialogue. But if someone's initial reaction is just blatant defensiveness, it may take them some time to kind of understand where those feelings for them are coming from.
I think, too, going off of what you're saying, Patrick, like when you're having a conversation with somebody who feels like they need to respond defensively, who feels like by making a statement like you have white privilege is an attack, it's often best to listen and hear what their concerns are too. Like why exactly do you feel defensive about this? Because it's not something that I'm attacking you with. Like, I'm obviously white as well. I obviously have white privilege also. But I think a big part of keeping that dialogue open and exploring those things is making sure that you're also providing a safe space for people to change their minds. I think a lot of times people get stuck that like, hey, I had this opinion for so long that like now I can't go back. Or they're going to call me a hypocrite, or they're going to bring up what I said in the past or what I did in the past. And I think that it's really important to make sure that you're having honest conversations, but also allowing the space for people to feel comfortable in addressing those feelings and why they become defensive at a statement like you have white privilege.
And kind of just like springboarding off of that too, some things that I found, especially within the last year of talking about these issues, is that if you're having a conversation with a loved one, specifically about privilege or racial inequality or anything like that, you may not change their mind in the first conversation. And that's incredibly frustrating, but sometimes change is a long game. And being patient with that person to a point, because it does get exhausting, especially as a BIPOC person, to keep explaining your struggle to people and they don't listen to you. But that's a whole other part. That's a whole other conversation. But giving an appropriate amount of patience to people is sometimes the only way to get through to them. And then I hate to throw this phrase out. If at a certain point they don't get it, it's on them.
So agreed. So in previous work, I work in violence. I used to work in violence prevention education, and healthy boundaries is a topic of conversation that is exceedingly important when talking about anti-violence work, for example. And I think oftentimes you have to utilize those healthy boundaries for yourself, because, like Kevin said, that conversation is exhaustive. And I would agree. I don't know that you're ever going to change their mind. Sometimes I don't know that necessarily changing their mind is the goal. However, I think recognizing that behavior is harmful is important, right? So if at the very least we can stop the harmful behavior, that's an important step.
Absolutely.
I agree. I think one thing I just wanted to add in here is that, I think there's something to be said a little bit about like when a white person is talking to another white person versus a person of color talking to a white person about white privilege. Sometimes for people of color, it can mean a different thing. It can be a different situation. So a precaution, I guess, that I'm just like sort of giving is that, if you're a person of color and you're trying to talk to somebody about white privilege, like what Patrick was saying, make sure that you're safe, and that you feel comfortable in that space, talking to that person. We just wouldn't want people to have anything terrible come from that. And I think even just recognizing the fact that it's just another form of white privilege to be able to talk for a white person to be able to talk to another white person about white privilege and maybe have better reception than a person of color talking to a white person about white privilege.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Sorry. I was trying not to cut anyone off. I don't know. Just a couple thoughts to add. So I think like what Kevin and Sonia were saying, like to make sure for like when you're talking to family, I feel like it can definitely be frustrating, especially as a person of color. But I think it's important to make sure you have the tools for yourself too, to know, like, so you can help yourself explain things better and can maybe give these people who don't want to like listen to you for the first time, at least, the tools to help themselves. So maybe like if they're being super defensive, being like, okay, let's stop the conversation. Maybe we'll come back to this after you've, had a little break, and then come back to it, and you can try to go from there. But there's a point when you can only try so much, and what you're saying might not help change them, but maybe trying to give them some other resources that can help them would be beneficial.
Which leads right into the next question. Going from one extreme to someone who's very defensive to the other extreme, which would be, how can I, as a white person, be an ally? What if that approach, if that type of personality, comes forward? What is the best way for white people to be an ally?
Yeah, so I have a lot of thoughts on. So I think the first question really is what is allyship, right? And I think it's really important to maybe identify allyship as an active journey in advocating for people and communities that you wish to support, right? Allyship is not a destination. Rather, it's the continued advocacy for the rights and the equity of others. If you identify as an ally, or if you're wanting to be an ally, I think it's really important to ask yourself, how am I an ally? What am I doing to maintain that title? I think that, like I said, that allyship, I think, is about that journey and not necessarily that destination. But I think that there's a few primary components that go into being an ally. I think the first is understanding your privilege. I want to be clear that privilege does not mean that you are rich, or that you've never had to struggle, or that you've never had to work hard. Really, what it means is that there are some things in life that you will never experience or never have to think about, just because of who you are, because of your identity. The second piece that I think is just as important is listening to listen versus listening to respond, right? If you're not willing to listen, then you're not able to learn about the issues that are important to the communities that you're trying to support. There's two more pieces, almost done, promise. The third is, I think, really to recognize that speaking up and not over, right? So the role of an ally is really to support and to utilize your voice, to utilize your privilege to educate others in the ways that isn't speaking over the community members that you're trying to support. And the final piece is realizing that you're going to make mistakes. You're not going to get it right. You're going to make mistakes. I can't stress that enough. What's really important is that when you do, apologize, and remember that allyship is not solely about your intent. Rather, allyship is about your impact. And what's really, really important is that your intent and that your impact are best aligned, right? So really having those two pieces in alignment. And I think the final thing is really just remembering that when you do make those mistakes, apologize and be authentic.
Jumping off of Patrick here, there's this idea of performative allyship, which can also kind of be triggering and kind of buzzy for people. And I'm also going to kind of throw in this idea of intersectionality and other different privileges in what I've got like throwing around in my head up here. There's being an ally. It's very important to, like Patrick said, listen to the voices that are speaking and not speaking over. There are a lot of issues, like I think of women's issues, and there are a lot of voices that are speaking up that I support, but I would never wish to speak over because I, as a man, do not have those experiences, but I can use my privilege as a man to speak in solidarity with women. There are issues, in LGBTQ issues, which I can speak for because I am on that spectrum. But there are some privileges within the LGBTQ spectrum that I don't have privilege because I'm Black. So I have to rely on my white allies to speak with me and not for me in those situations. So there's all these different kinds of privileges. And like, I know we're talking about white privilege a lot, and that's coming up a lot, but there's like so many different kinds of privileges that any one single person can have. If you put me next to a Black woman, I have in society more privilege than her because I'm a dude. And we're still Black. We both don't have like an obscene amount of privilege, but my voice can be louder than hers or would be listened to more than hers just because I'm a guy. There's also those issues in, socioeconomic stuff, and I can go on and on about that. So if people have more questions about different kinds of privileges, please shoot them up. But it's also about using your privilege as an ally to speak with and not over. I need you to speak with me, not for me. And I think that's really important to consider. And especially, again, in this last year of kind of things that have been happening, a lot of people want to get their revolutionary fantasies out of their systems, but that don't use my struggle for that. You know what I mean? You have to really stop and think, am I doing this with you instead of for you? And so that's what I have to say about that.
Yeah, I think on those same lines, being an ally, I think you really need to focus every single day on if you're making assumptions or if you're really listening, if you're uplifting and raising the voices that you claim to be. I think it's really important that is a constant evolution. There's no finish line for like, okay, I checked all the boxes. Now I'm not racist anymore. I'm a permanent ally. Like that doesn't work. It's got to be like an everyday thing where it's like, sometimes I wake up and I'm tired and I don't want to watch the news, but like for some people that's a privilege that I have, that I can just turn it off and not have to worry about it. And I think that's a critical thing to think about when you claim to be an ally of marginalized communities.
Definitely. And allyship has evolved even so much since last summer. I think specifically when the George Floyd situation started, there was this blackout day on social media. Do you guys remember that? And people were posting black squares. And for some of my friends, that's as much as they said about the issue. It's like, I'm going to post this black square. I'm an ally. Yay. But sometimes you don't realize that posting that black square and hashtagging blackout day is suppressing information that out like people on the street and allies are looking for, and it doesn't add to any advocacy. It's again performative. So allyship looks a lot different now than just posting a black square. It's looking for resources, it's talking to people, it's supporting your friends with words rather than just a picture. That's the minimum now, and anything less than that is not quite what we need. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead. I apologize, Natasha.
Okay. I was just gonna say, jumping off of that, yeah, I think what's so important is that if you want to be an ally, and you need to first obviously recognize your privilege, be it white privilege, any of all, there, like Kevin said, there's so many different privileges that you can have, is recognizing that and educating yourself. Like, that's so crucial, and learning how you can uplift these other people who don't have your privilege. So
as Kevin was speaking, the thing that sparked in my brain was, I think sometimes we have to decide what type of advocate we're going to be, right, or how we're going to be involved, and that's an important component, I think, to allyship as well, is really kind of looking within yourself and really making those decisions of, how am I going to be involved in the process? How am I going to be involved in the conversation? And along with, I think, that sort of that self-reflection is really a lot of the elements that Kevin spoke to in respects to not being performative, right? But again, having the alignment of intent and impact, I think is a crucial component. So I just wanted to add that.
yeah, I think that's an important thing too, is like that you were saying, is that it's not like to be an ally you have to go out in the streets. Like, that's not the only thing that you have to do or can do. Like, there's so many ways to be an ally. Sorry, Sonia.
All right, let's move on to the next question.
Sonia, I think you're muted.
Are you muted, Sonia?
Sorry, I am.
Oh, there you are. So let's not move on to the next question quite yet.
Sorry,
Sonia, I didn't mean to cut you off.
I'll be super quick. Just the thing that I wanted to add to that was another way that I think, even I like to do myself is look at, for example, social media. So like for Instagram is just purely an example of this. I follow a lot of artists. I'm an artist. I like following artists and looking at what they make. So I looked at, who am I following in artists, and is that a diverse group of artists that I'm following? And granted, I like a very specific type of art, so I try to find artists that make that specific type of art. But I had noticed that I wasn't really following that many people of color. And that's a problem itself within the art world. But there are people out there that are people of color that are making the type of art that I'm interested in. And so I think trying to fill your life in different ways with people of color and their voices and what they're making, what they're doing, you can learn from that, and also be able to hear what they're saying. If they're expressing that they need something from their community, from their government, from their society, then hopefully you can understand that and help them work to get that to that space. I think, that's something that's really important is really listening and hearing them, and then utilizing what you can do to move that progress along.
Since you had brought up social media, I think that's a good transition into the next question, because it's a question that you almost just pluck from social media and media in general. Why talk about racism? Doesn't that create divisiveness in the community? Don't all lives matter? Things that we've all heard. What do you say to that?
So I guess I can kind of start with this. So I think, again, it goes back to what we were talking about earlier. So it's not about creating divisiveness. It's recognizing differences and appreciating them, and uplifting them as well. It's nobody's trying to separate anybody or feel bad for being different than the status quo. We're trying to recognize those differences, appreciate them, appreciate how people, live differently, feel things differently, express themselves differently, and allow them that, that common decency to live their lives and kind of, express themselves in the way that they always have or want to. And for the comment about all lives matter, so I think I'll use this analogy that I think kind of gets used a lot, but hopefully it helps people understand. So one of them is that, say your house is on fire, and you call the ambulance, and they decide to go to every other house on your block instead of yours. And you're like, my house is on fire though. And you're doing everything for all these other houses. So it's sort of like the idea that, yes, all different houses matter. All those houses on that block matter. But the house that's on fire is the one that needs attention right now. And so that's why we're paying attention to it. That's why we're caring for it and shouting Black Lives Matter. Because there is a feeling that Black lives don't matter, because the attention and the care is not being given in the way that we would hope or would like to see.
Anyone else have anything to add? Or does that cover everyone? Everyone's answer.
I do have a little bit to say. I feel like I've been talking a lot, so please cut me off if I talk too much. But
thank you, Kevin. That was great.
Thank you. But yeah, I mean, we do talk about race, and we talk about the diversity in our communities because we want to bring attention to the cultures that are being neglected. I think specifically in Manitowoc, we have a huge Hmong population, we have a huge Hispanic population, a huge Black population, and we want to create a space where all of these cultures and more that I'm not even naming feel comfortable to express their identities in a safe place, where everybody can enjoy it, and it doesn't matter if you're Black, white, anywhere in the spectrum in between these experiences. But an analogy that works for me, because I was a choir kid, is, if you ever sang in a 4-part choir, and I don't know how many of you have, sometimes the director says, we need to bring out the tenors more, or we need to bring out the altos, because we want to create a balance of sound. And that's what we're trying to do when we say Black Lives Matter, when we say Asian Lives Matter. We're not saying that they don't. We're bringing them out we're trying to create a balance by saying that and mentioning that, which I think is very important to mention.
Yeah, so I have some thoughts as well, and so I think of course, all lives matter, right? I think that we need to understand that Black Lives Matter as a statement comes from the invisibility, the pain, and the inequity that a community has experienced through the loss of loved ones, right? I think that we really need to understand where that statement comes from. I think the statement brings awareness to a conversation about that inequity and asks, how will we bring about meaningful change, right? And I really appreciate the comparisons that were shared. One comparison that I think resonates is Save the Rainforest, for example, right? Save the Rainforest does not mean other trees don't matter. Rather, there's a need for actionable steps towards equity. And I think that's the piece that we really need to remember when we are hearing and saying Black Lives Matter. So yeah.
Yeah, I love all of these analogies. I think so talking about racism doesn't create divisiveness. I think it just highlights what we need to educate people about, specifically for, our community. Like, it shows what's lacking in what maybe people don't understand. So it's like, we need to talk about these issues. We need to talk about why maybe don't say all lives matter in reference to when people say Black Lives Matter, because it's important to realize that, like we've all said, yes, all lives matter, but it's which group of people needs the most help at this moment. Like, who needs to be uplifted and celebrated. So.
And I just want to say quick too, sorry, was I cutting you off, Sonia?
Go for it.
I love the word intersectionality. I think it's really important because it's been a huge part of my experience. But there's sometimes I feel like people get this idea that when we say Black Lives Matter, that, we're neglecting other groups of people. I will just as quickly say Hispanic Lives Matter, Asian Lives Matter, and in the same breath, as I would say Black Lives Matter. And I would say the same to I would say German lives matter too. And I mean, and I would say that white lives matter too, because, it's an umbrella term. But they're not being, discriminated against in a lot of social and, government ways and blah, blah, I've been seeing a lot of things on I'm a big TikToker, on TikTok about a lack of intersectionality or a lack of support between different racial groups. And that's not the tea. That's not it. Cause but I'm not, what am I trying to say? It does happen, obviously, that there are some people who would not throw up the same amount of support for other people. And I think that's a shame. But we have to uplift each other in order to bring us to a place of equality, or equity, rather, I think is a better word.
So one thing that I guess I'll add, in regard to the divisiveness in the community. So I think it sort of relates to what we were talking about before as well, about listening to people of color when they're telling you that something is happening or something is needed. I think if we look at even just our population of people of color in Manitowoc, we can almost guarantee that many of them would have experienced some sort of racism in their lives or in the community, or or would like to see things be better for everyone. So I think, if you feel that it's creating divisiveness, I would suggest, talking to more people of color in the community and seeing how they feel about that, and seeing if they feel like there's things going on in the community that could be better for everybody. Because coming from a person that is half Mexican, I don't see it as divisiveness. I see it as trying to make it better for my family, and for my friends that are people of color.
So speaking specifically of the community, let's move on to the next question, which asks, this ties into what you were just saying, Sonia. Where do you see white privilege in the community? Not just specifically to Sonia, but to the entire group.
You're on mute.
Yeah, Amanda, you're muted.
Okay, got it. What I was saying is this is something that I noticed heavily when I became involved in Love. I've been a part of this community for a really long time, like kind of, customer service. So I know a lot of people, I see a lot of people. But what I didn't notice until coming back here and becoming involved with Love was how many spaces were just very white, that like people of color or marginalized communities just wouldn't step foot in, not because they felt unsafe, but just because they felt uncomfortable walking into a place and having everybody in there look at them because they're the one person that sticks out in a white crowd. I didn't notice how prevalent that was in this town until I started getting involved with Love. And I think that that's also represented in places of power and people who are in leadership in this town. And I think that it's something that we could definitely work on improving, that representation really does matter, that we could possibly make this community a place where everybody feels welcome in public spaces.
Yeah, so I think along those same lines. So I moved to Manitowoc in 2012, and for those who may even be listening, who know me well, I often identify that I still had a bag packed 3 years in, which is not entirely an untruth. The transition to the community was really, really hard. It was it was difficult because I, even as a cisgender white guy, was seen very much so as other. I didn't grow up around here. I wasn't from around here, and it was really difficult to, I think, create friend groups that were of like-minded. That was a challenge. So with that being said, I hear prejudice and bias in our language. So when we as a community speak negatively about affordable housing developments, for example, and the reason that we are speaking negatively about that, or that we're identifying concerns about that, is because we're worried about those people moving in. Well, I think we really have to ask ourselves, when we say those people, who are we talking about, right? And I think normalizing that is not okay. And I think we really have to ask ourselves, what are we really saying when we are saying those types of things? I think that it's also really important to understand that Manitowoc has a history of being a sundown town. And if you're not familiar with that term, I definitely encourage you to understand what that means. I think it's important to recognize that we as a community have work to do in creating more welcoming, more inclusive environments where everyone can live without fear of being targeted for who they are.
Does anyone want to go over the term sundown town for those people who might be following along that aren't familiar with the term? Anyone?
I can.
Okay,
Yes, please.
great.
So, I actually just recently got the book at the suggestion of Patrick, actually, which is Sundown Towns. And so basically what happened was that at sundown, any people of color needed to leave the city. They weren't allowed to be in the city. And so they had to go elsewhere. For Manitowoc specifically, I'm not entirely sure on where that was. But in this specific book that I just referenced, Sundown Towns, you can find it on Amazon or wherever if you don't want to support Jeff Bezos. But so it's
Your local library, maybe?
yes,
For
your local
example,
library.
I'll find out.
Yes. So in that book, they specifically mentioned Manitowoc and some pretty interesting things about Manitowoc specifically being a sundown town and things that were said and done. So that's a little brief sort of synopsis about that. And then I guess to slightly move back onto the question of where do you see white privilege in the community, I just wanted to add that if you look around and see different entities within our community, who's represented, just take a look, go into, look at local government, who's represented there, like who are city workers, who's represented there, who is represented in our schools as teachers, as the school board, who is represented in positions of power. And that tells you a little bit about what kind of power dynamics there are in terms of white privilege in our community. And I don't think it's always not necessarily that there's people that wouldn't want to run for, office or be a city employee or any of those entities that I mentioned. It's just sometimes with representation, we don't see ourselves, or if there's a lack of representation, we don't see ourselves in those positions. So we don't necessarily think that those positions are for us. I know for me, there's been people that are in positions of power that are Hispanic, and I looked at them and I was like, oh my gosh, wow, like I could actually like do something like that. And that's amazing, because that was the first time I ever thought about being in that type of position before. And that's solely because the person was Hispanic. And it's weird, and it may sound weird, but that's kind of how it works. We don't see ourselves. And that may be hard to understand for a lot of people that are white, because especially, even in television, in our media consumption, we grew up predominantly watching white people on TV. And if you're used to seeing that as a white person, then you're just used to it, and you don't really think about the fact that we don't really see as many, Hispanic female leads in movies or TV shows. So yeah, I think representation is a huge thing for the community, and that we need to have more of.
Not to rush things along, but I want Sonia, you're providing exceptionally good springboards from one question to the next with your answers to the questions. I'm going to move on to the next question. Not that people can't add into the last one as we went, but this question applies specifically to what you were saying. How does pop culture influence or affect the issue of white privilege? Does it shine a spotlight on the topic to make people more aware and adjust their behavior, or does it serve to entrench it even further? I mean, there's a lot there, so
Definitely.
grab any part of it and run with it.
So I think with pop culture, I think that I love this question. I think it's really interesting. So I think with pop culture, it really depends on what it is. Kind of like what I was talking about with TV shows or films, online media, YouTube, things like that. Who are we seeing the most of? Who are we not seeing in, even in lead roles, like I was saying? Who's predominantly always the side character. And I think that's starting to change for the better a lot more in the past few years. But I think there's still a lot of work to be done for that. For music and things like that, I think that's a little bit different of a ball game. But I'll let somebody else kind of take over from there if you have any comments.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, Kevin.
Oh, go ahead, Natasha. Go ahead.
Sorry, I was just gonna say. So when I look at the question, I see like both. Like for the second question, like does it shine a spotlight on it or does it like make it worse? And I think it definitely does both. Like depending on the situation. Like I think recently in media we've been seeing a lot of more stuff talking about protests and like in shows and stuff they're highlighting. I think my sister said on Grey's Anatomy last night they had something about protests, so people are learning about it that way and bringing more attention to it. But I also think sometimes when they bring attention to it, they do it in a negative way, and that just kind of does not help at all. So it's like, I don't know. It's complicated.
Very, very complicated. Springboarding off of something Sonia mentioned about representation in media, I have a lot of insight in the theater world, in the theater aspects, and then some film aspects too. I've been able to be brought into a lot of rooms over the last year to talk about how to improve diversity in theater and in representation in media and this, that, and the other thing. And it definitely has to start behind the table. So we're talking about like who's casting your movies, who's directing your shows, that kind of thing, because then we're able to bring in different voices. And it is very interesting to talk about representation in media because you do see certain tropes perpetuated through media. Like Sonia said, like who is the best friend, who is being portrayed as the villain. There's a lot of media where often you wouldn't even realize this, but if the villain is portrayed by a Black person, they're often portrayed as a dark-skinned Black person. And so there's that kind of hang up that goes about it. And if there's a love interest, if there is a person who's supposed to be desirable or something like that, if it's played by a Black person, it's usually played by a light-skinned Black person because of that proximity to whiteness. It's more digestible to what the norm is. So we have to kind of see that for what it is and I don't want to say call people out, but know what we're seeing and be able to separate what we see from what we know is true in our experiences. I think it's very important to do that. And I mean, like Natasha said too, social media is a beautifully large rabbit hole that we could just keep falling through and never quite get to the butt of the answer. But I think we have to be smart about how we're consuming and what we're consuming and be able to separate fact from fiction, which we did a live about not too long ago. Thanks, Julia.
Which also will be coming up next month on the library. Julia is representing that fact versus fake discussion.
Yay!
Yay,
So, thank you for the inadvertent plug. On May 6th is when it's happening. Great. I didn't mean to cut you off. Sorry.
No, that's all I had to say. Okay. Oh, sorry, Patrick. Go, Tom.
No worries. I definitely wanted to just say I absolutely agree with what Natasha, Kevin, and Sonia really identified. And I think the only thing that I really have to add to that is the reason that representation matters is because these are our stories that are being told, right? The reason that it's important for us to see ourselves, whether that's someone who identifies as within the LGBTQ community or whether that's a person of color, these are our stories that are being told, right? Like when we see ourselves being portrayed in those maybe multi-dimensional ways, right? Like we then see ourselves. And the reason that I speak to the aspect of dimension is because oftentimes, I'm older. I'm not going to say how old I am because this is probably being recorded. So, but certainly in the early '90s, when I saw representation of gay people, they were very one-dimensional. Often often the source of the joke, and not someone who was being appreciated or spoken about in a positive way. And as media kind of really has evolved, I, for example, have gotten the opportunity to see more dimension of gay men in particular, especially like if we're watching like Modern Family, for example. And when I look back at the original Will and Grace, I might give you a contextual clue to my age, but versus the reboot of Will and Grace, there's a lot of commonality there, but there's more dimension. Also, when we're talking about like maybe like Queer Eye for the Straight Guy, or the Fab Five, right? So like the original was really focused on tolerance. The reboot was really focused on acceptance. And I think you really kind of get a different feel and a different understanding of how those things are not the same and different, and that dimension of the story that's being told, that dimension of representation is so incredibly vital to underrepresented communities.
Great. Thank you for these to all these really thought-provoking, thoughtful answers to these 5 questions. At this point, I am going to turn to questions and comments that were made online during the presentation. We had a lot of people submit things. We don't have a lot of time left. So I'm going to focus basically on the comments or larger comments that are made, about societal things. I encourage all 5 of you to go back to both Facebook and YouTube to look at the comments, because there are a lot of comments just thanking you, for your participation tonight and things like that. But since we only have you for really, because there's a closing portion to the evening regarding resources that are available to people should they want to find out more that I want to touch on, I'm going to go through these pretty quickly. So let's see what we can get to in the next 10, 15 minutes or so. So Michael Slattery had a comment here. White privilege is not limited to the U.S., as Amanda was bringing up sort of earlier. I have seen it around the world, South America, EU, Japan, Southeast Asia. Further, it is an unconscious and conscious treatment because of social, economic, cultural, and religious dominant values. Anyone have anything to add on that?
I have a little, and I don't have a lot of worldly experiences, but I do have to think about, again, proximity to whiteness is a big deal, and that definitely doesn't just affect the US. You can see in a lot of foreign media, even the Western standard of beauty has been like the standard for quite some time in our world. And so it's more often than not about, how close we can be to that standard. That's where you get like skin bleaching products in Africa, and that's where you get Well, I don't know because I can't think of anything else. But but that's where you get some of those things coming in. I don't know if I've used the word colorism yet in this chat. Have I? It's been a while. So colorism is kind of an internal racism that's all about the proximity to whiteness. And it's a racism that plagues a lot of BIPOC groups. So I think it goes back to like slavery times, and they had the paper bag test. If you're not familiar, it's like how light you are compared to a paper bag, which is basically like saying, you know, whether you're working in a field or if you're working in a house. And if you're working in a house, you're closer to whiteness, which makes you better. So there's that whole spectrum of colorism, even within BIPOC groups of people, that we have to jump through. And it all goes back to the proximity to whiteness, which is what we're talking about today.
Yeah, so I was going to add, because you guys made me think of this, is so I like to tan outside, not in a tanning salon. And, you know, I love that. I love being outside. And when I would visit my family, that's like, I'd be like, they would do my makeup and they would make me lighter. And I'd be like, oh, this is weird. And they're like, oh, well, it's better to be lighter. And I'm just like, that's so like insane to me as someone who, I mean, I have all these different dynamics I'm thinking of. Like here, I'm like, oh, I like to tan. But then when you think of being with my family, they're like, oh, well, you need to actually be lighter. Not, they don't say that, but you know, they're like the makeup, they're like, you know, kind of implying that. And it's just like, it's crazy to think about. And then the same thing, it's like you were talking about, Kevin, in Pakistan and India, you know, that is a thing. Like being lighter is seen as being better. And it's, you know, it's just, yeah.
There was a comment. I'm not going to post the whole thing because it was rather long, but that, you know, class also plays a large factor in white privilege and privilege in general. Would you agree with that as well?
So I kind of want to jump in on that one. I would agree that it is a factor, right? And it certainly is an element that can, I think, provide greater ability, greater opportunity, right? So classism absolutely is a factor. I think, though, it's really important to not dismiss other privileges that are based on whiteness, for example, or that are based on race, with the excuse of classism, right? And I think that's a really that's a really important component. So while I agree with that statement, I would strongly caution putting too much emphasis on classism in relationship to or connecting it to white privilege or privileges or other privileges in general. I think sometimes when we're talking about privilege, it is important to look at each of those privileges individually, and then also, as Kevin has identified, utilize the intersectionality of privilege and privileges and power and oppression and dominance and all of those components that go into intersectionality, and then also kind of examine it from that way as well.
There's another comment, and unfortunately, I want to bring it up, but it's also cut off because it was very long. What the person was saying, it's of a dissenting nature to what you guys are saying. But I would like to hear what you have to say on what this person posted, and I can't read you the entire thing, not because it's particularly extremely inflammatory or anything. It just ran out of space. It only allows so many characters. So I'll read what he. I'm assuming perhaps it's a he or a she. The name of the person was Manti Thorne, and he commented, "Isolation of difference is not inclusivity. In America, there are many resources to lift people up. Proclaiming others who are not privy to the same resources as others due to their color of their skin as mere privilege is lunacy. In fact, it most certainly could be argued that what is taking place is race shaming. Are you asserting that specific people are more privileged due to their skin color because you seek to find that answer in society? And he or she went on to comment more, but I don't have the entirety, and I believe it was leading to a question, which I don't have. But what do you have to, what would your commentary be on that? I mean, particularly race shaming, I think, was the central idea of what he was trying to bring up.
So I can take that a little bit. So, this is not about shame. I think we kind of talked about that in the beginning, where when Kevin was giving us the definition of white privilege. This isn't about, shaming white people in any way, really. It's about saying that growing up or being white, you just won't have the experience of what it's like to be of a different color and what that comes along with in your life. So we've sort of all talked about our different experiences. Me being mixed, Natasha being mixed, Kevin being Black, Patrick being gay. There's different things that we all have had hardships, and we also have privileges. But being white is not something that some of us have that privilege in a society that's mostly based on white people and a white society. Like we were talking about representation. We see mostly white people as our representation in society, whether that be locally or more expansively into the United States as a whole. But I think the thing is that it's not about shaming people. It's not, like we said, it's not about guilt. It's just acknowledging that people come with different privileges and how we utilize that or how we recognize that, and then how we move throughout the world once we acknowledge that.
Yeah, Tim, can you read the first sentence of that statement again?
Certainly. Let me get back up to it. Isolation of difference is not inclusivity. The following sentence.
So that I would agree with, right? Isolation is not inclusivity. And I don't know that any one of us on the panel today has advocated for any type of isolation. Rather, I think we have been advocating for inclusivity, right? In the conversation, I think we have identified the importance of having greater conversations, having greater discussion, having greater dialogue, of learning from one another, of their lived experiences, right? I think I would disagree with the notion that we are taking bits and pieces and examining certain elements of culture or society to tell us a truth that we want to hear. Rather, I think that we are trying to have a very expansive conversation that really looks holistically at lived experiences. Hence the conversation about intersectionality, right? So intersectionality looks at the various identities of an individual and then goes to the next step of examining how that individual has experienced privilege, how that individual has experienced oppression, right? Given time and or space, we all experience privilege and we all experience oppression based on our individual identities, right? That's a really important piece that I would hope that viewer or that person who wrote that dissension would really maybe perhaps understand, is that we all move through the world with various levels of privilege, and we all move through the world with various levels of oppression. For some of us, that level of privilege is greater, and for some of us, that level of oppression is greater. And some of us, maybe that's even kind of just a sort of a balance, right? I want to say that as a cisgender gay white man, I move through the world with a lot of power and a lot of privilege. And there are times that I experience oppression. I experience those things both and, because nothing exists in a vacuum.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for addressing that. And, I think it's also good to get, dissenting viewpoints out there so that it can be addressed in this manner, so that the conversation can increase. And, as you're talking about that, if one is not being hateful or derogatory in their questioning, but simply presenting a different point of view, it keeps conversation going. So thank you for addressing that. On to the next question, because there's a lot of them. There's no way I'm going to get to everything, but would you be willing to address the term reverse racism and your thoughts on it, since it seems to be used as a defense when discussing white privilege?
Yay. I've been stalking the Facebook comments and I saw this and I was like, we should definitely talk about it. The idea of reverse racism has been something that I've heard before, and it's tough to, hold on, let my brain catch up with me. I feel like the notion of being reverse racist is not a real thing. But when we talk about racism, we're talking about putting down a marginalized group for their skin tone or their skin color. That's not the Webster's dictionary definition, but that's what the working definition I have right now. And when we're talking about white privilege, we're talking about the majority, and I think it's really tough to put down a majority for the color of their skin. Can somebody help me out here? I feel like I'm grasping at straws, but I feel like I'm on to something.
Sure. So I think what you're getting at, Kevin, is that, if we look at our society, right, and historically also for our society, so for the United States, who has experienced racism and has been oppressed, and that is most often people of color, right? So that would define the racism, is that we are within a society that is predominantly ruled, for lack of a better term, by white folks. So to claim reverse racism, it doesn't really work, because the white people have the most power and privilege in our society because of how our society is and how it was formed, back in the day when colonism was a thing. So reverse racism doesn't really work in that way, simply because it's in a society where the most privilege and power is on white people.
So I think that maybe the better way to frame that term, reverse racism, I think, is maybe to refocus the conversation on the reality that we all have prejudice and bias, right? So let me say that again. We all have prejudice and bias, right? Depending on what those prejudices or those biases may be, we're exercising that prejudice and that bias towards someone or a community, right? So I think I would caution on the use of the term reverse racism, because I would caution on the term, right? I would caution on the use of that term. Rather, I think I would refocus the conversation to talking more about those prejudices and those biases that we all have, right? And we have them based on our lived experiences, based on how, what we were taught growing up, about a particular group of people or groups of people. So I think that's maybe more so where the conversation should be.
So I think just to add quickly, one last point is just a quote from the Alberta Civil Liberties Research Center.
I was just going to do that too, Sonia.
Which is, reverse racism is a myth because it attempts to ignore the power/privilege dynamic between the individuals/groups involved. The myth of reverse racism assumes that racism occurs on a so-called level playing field, when in actually it does not. So I think that's a better eloquated way of what I was getting at before. There is not a level playing field in the United States, if that's what we're focusing on.
Thank you, everyone, for making words make sense.
Amanda, what did you want to add?
I just saw like a really great analogy for this not too long ago, that recognizing white privilege in society does not, it's not asking for more points for their team, for the marginalized. Oh my gosh, I can't make words either. It's not extra points for their team. It's not, or they're being, never mind. I can't make sports analogies. I'm done.
I feel where you're going, though.
I think what she's getting at is it's just about equity more so than asking for more. It's not about asking for more than just equity, equality. It's literally just being accepted and unity.
Yes. I saw something again on TikTok because that's where I live. The notion of knowing that there's a discrepancy and not wanting it for yourself, but then not willing to face the conversation about it. And I think that it plays a factor in like the larger conversation about privilege. But I also think that that's a huge step in recognizing any kind of privilege for yourself.
Because we are up against time, I'm going to pop back myself into the picture. But before we go, I want to tell everyone that, and people on the panel, if you haven't been following along with the comments, please do, because there is a lot of stuff in there that we didn't get to. So please, check out the comments on Facebook and on YouTube to all 5 panelists. But at this point, I would like to turn this back to Sonia, I believe, to tell us about some resources that are available, and then just give everyone a chance to provide any closing commentary. But let's get to the resources first. Sonia, if you wanted to take this on.
Sorry, I was muted.
Oh, okay.
All right. So where you can find us is at our website, lakeshoresunitedvisionaries.org, or facebook.com/lakeshoresunitedvisionaries. Instagram is at lakeshoresunitedvisionaries. Twitter is Love Manitowoc. And our email is lakeshoresunitedvisionaries@gmail.com. And as always, please feel free to contact us with any civil conversation and questions. We are always for civil discourse. So if you want to email us, or if you want to send us a DM through any of our social media, we'd be happy to chat with you.
also,
Oh.
go ahead.
And then we have just a list of resources here. So we have some books that we recommend reading that talk more about white privilege, how to be anti-racist, things like that. We will also be posting this list, I believe, in the chat of this or the comments, and then possibly to the page as a separate form as well. And then some online resources of different things that you can check out and read as well.
There are actually several pages of online resources. So I did want to bring this to people's attention. If anyone would like a PDF version of the PowerPoint presentation that we had this evening, and also for all the resources that probably may have been a little small, to read along with, but there are fantastic resources included in the PowerPoint presentation. Just send an email to my email address, which is scrolling along the bottom here, tkaczynski@manitowoc.org. Just send me an email and I would be more than happy to send you a PDF version of the PowerPoint. And I will get that to you, to anyone who sends me an email requesting it. So I will let my name scroll slowly across the bottom one last time before removing it. I just wanted to thank Natasha, Kevin, Sonia, Amanda, and Patrick for this great conversation this evening. Thank you so much for putting yourselves out there. Thank you for answering the questions that were thrown at you. Some of them we had a little bit before, but I wish we could have gotten to more of them that were asked online because there were many. Just thank you so much for participating in this evening.
Yeah, and I just want to say thank you, a huge thank you to Tim for all his work with StreamYard and getting this set up. It was wonderful, and thank you for being a part of it. And also a huge thank you to the Manitowoc Public Library. They've been absolutely wonderful. So please go show them some love and support. We definitely appreciate them in our community.
I also want to just kind of say thank you to the viewers for tonight. I think engaging in this discussion and dialogue is something that we as a community can do more of. And as we do it in meaningful ways, we create that greater understanding and we create a more welcoming, more inclusive environment.
Absolutely. And in general, people didn't just zip in and leave this evening. People stayed and listened to the conversation, which, whether they agreed 100%, whether they disagreed 100%, if they were somewhere in the middle, they stayed and listened. And I think that's valuable and important. It's not the end of the road, but it's a great thing to get started. So, and you're welcome, Sonia, for the kind words. Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, everyone. And I know we're up against time, so I'm going to bring the evening to an end, unless anyone has any final things they want to say to wrap up. Nope, we're all good. Oh, Sonia, I think you're on mute.
Oh, I don't think I'm muted. Can you hear me?
Oh, now I can.
Okay. I just want to reiterate saying, thank you to the community for listening to us. I know that not everybody agrees with, a lot of what we were saying, but as always, I just really want to stress that we are always open to civil conversation. Obviously, civil meaning nothing derogatory. As we started out with the disclaimers with this, that won't be tolerated with us. But we would love to have more conversations with you, with the community. If you ever have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. And thank you so much for giving us the time today out of your day. We appreciate it.
And there was an awful lot to unpack in this 2 hours of conversation. If anyone wants to go back and watch it again, minutes after we end the broadcast, it will be archived both on Manitowoc Public Library's Facebook page and on our YouTube channel. So if you think it's of value to refer other people to it, please do, because it will be there essentially forever. So go back and review anything you need to. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Have a great night. As always, knowledge is power, and accumulating as much and as diverse an array of knowledge is absolutely crucial. So thank you very much for being here tonight. As Sonia said, thank you to the community for tuning in, and have a great evening. Thank you.